Good morning. This is Sharon Black, and I am reporting from Baltimore, Maryland, for Struggle La Lucha. I'm privileged to be able to interview Leonardo Flores. Flores was a former staff member of the Venezuelan Embassy when it was under the possession of its rightful owners. He was born in Venezuela and is presently the Latin American campaign coordinator for Code Pink. And he stays in close contact with social movements in Venezuela. Leo Flores, activists have ignited a movement around the hashtag Fight COVID Not Venezuela. And we here in Baltimore have added the slogan Fight COVID and Racism, given the disproportionate deaths of Black and brown people that are being recorded around the country. Could you elaborate on the recent events, that is the war threats and the maneuvers by the Trump regime and US imperialism against Venezuela? And also, if you can, could you describe in deeper terms what all this actually means?
Sure, and first of all, thanks for having me on, Sharon. So on April 1st, the Trump administration announced it was deploying dozens of Navy vessels and airplanes, as well as thousands of troops to just off Venezuelan waters and to bases around Venezuela in what they're calling a massive counter-narcotics operation. And this follows up the Department of Justice's indictment of President Nicolas Maduro and 13 others, which occurred in late March. I mean, you know, their pretext is counter narcotics, but which is absolutely absurd because the real reason is, of course, regime change. But let's talk a little bit about this kind of false charge of narco-terrorism that Maduro was indicted on. And it's, you know, preposterous because 92% of the cocaine in the United States comes from Colombia. 93% of the cocaine that flows out of South America either comes from the Pacific coast or the Western Caribbean, where Venezuela doesn't have coastlines. At most 7% comes from the Eastern Caribbean, and not all of that comes from Venezuela. So Venezuela is kind of stuck between the world's biggest producer of cocaine, which is Colombia, and the world's biggest consumer of cocaine, which is the United States. And at worst, it is a transit country since Venezuela doesn't produce cocaine at all. And so the fact that the U.S. is targeting Venezuela for counter-narcotics operations is, you know, ridiculous, because if drugs were really the issue, then they would target the Pacific, they would target Colombia. Instead, Colombia receives billions in security aid, despite the fact that this aid is A, totally ineffective in curbing cocaine production and trade, and B, linked to horrible human rights abuses, including the assassinations of social leaders in Colombia over the past, 20, 25 years. So in kind of the bigger scope of things, we've seen the Trump administration kind of up the ante in recent months. Last month, they set up a new name for their strategy, which was very reminiscent of what they're doing in Iran, because it's the same phrasing, maximum pressure. This new maximum pressure strategy on Venezuela that's meant to include more sanctions, more threats of military intervention, and this new Navy deployment. And what's really dangerous about the deployment is that it can mean anything, right? So a current Pentagon official was quoted in Newsweek as saying that they believe that drugs are being smuggled on oil tankers between Venezuela and Cuba. Cuba has an exemplary record in fighting drug trafficking. No serious analyst considers Cuba to have a significant role in the drug trade at all. And so this is really kind of a pretext, and my fear is that they're going to start boarding oil tankers between Venezuela and Cuba, saying that they're searching for drugs, but who knows what they're going to do with that oil. If they're likely going to keep it. And I've based that on what Trump has said several times in the past couple of years about how oil in Iraq or in Syria should go to the United States to help pay for US military expenditures there. And so someone has to pay for the expenditures in the Caribbean right now, and Trump is going to try to make it so that it's not the American taxpayers, but it will be in the long run. And in addition to the danger that Venezuela is facing through this, there's also a danger to U.S. service members right now during this coronavirus pandemic. We saw, what was it, about a week ago on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the captain kind of blew the whistle on the fact that there were over 400 sailors on a ship with coronavirus. And that, the rest of the people on the ship, there were 3,000 total, were at risk. And in retaliation, he got fired. But when you're putting all these people on ships and on bases all over the Caribbean, it presents a huge public health risk to to increase the amount of troops in close quarters. And what was the second part of the question was what it all means, right? So it's part of the Trump administration's ongoing regime change strategy. And that strategy is mostly based upon the fact that Trump desperately needs to win Florida in the next election. That's his only really path to victory, is if it includes Florida. And in Florida, of course, we have right-wing Cuban Americans that have been there for about 60 years now. And we've had an influx of right-wing Venezuelans over the past 20 years. And so these people don't just represent a kind of an important voting bloc in a state that usually decided by 1 or 2 percentage points in nation, excuse me, in presidential elections, but they're also important sources of financing. They've been financing both the Republican and Democratic parties for years now, and Trump represents for them, their kind of ideal goal, which is a military invasion of Venezuela, regardless of what it might cost the Venezuelan people or the people of the United States.
I was wondering, since some of the listeners may be new, could you describe some of the attempts by U.S. imperialism to destabilize Venezuela, whether it's been the sanctions, what that means, or the recent coup attempts?
Sure. So this is nothing new. I know I've been talking about Trump a lot, but this goes back all the way to the Bush administration, George W. Bush, and basically to 1999 when Chavez was elected, when he first came into office, rather. The first US-backed coup attempt happened in 2002 when the government of Chavez was overthrown, but only for 48 hours because he was basically kidnapped by a disloyal sector of the military. And the day after he was kidnapped, there was mass mobilization on the streets of Venezuela. Black, brown, indigenous, working class people came out and demanded that the president be returned. And the coup mongers, the people who had taken power, basically had no answer for this, and they had to give up. And Chavez came back. It was amazing. That it's one of the things that before this coup attempt, I had been living here in the United States, and I had followed Venezuela because they had just approved a really kind of progressive constitution, but I didn't feel so tied to it because I wasn't quite sure what was going on. But I paid a lot of attention during those 48 hours, and just to see the mass mobilization happening made me realize what an incredible people's struggle this really was. And that, for me, I don't want to say it radicalized me because I was already fairly radical in my politics, but it gave me kind of an undying loyalty to the Venezuelan people because they're the ones at the heart of this movement. So that was back in 2002. And since then, there have been repeated attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government, and especially through economic warfare. So George W. Bush in 2006, he implemented the first sanctions against Venezuela, and these were on the defense sector, prohibiting Venezuela from buying any U.S. military weapons or any components of that had been made in the U.S. And prior to these sanctions, Venezuela was basically a consumer a customer of the U.S. military defense defense complex, military industrial complex. And so this forced Venezuela to completely reorganize or reorient its purchases of military equipment. Of course, the two other players in this industry that never use U.S. components are China and Russia, and that kind of set off deepened ties between China, Russia, Venezuela. Then with the Obama administration in 2015, he signed an executive order calling Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States, which is also preposterous. Venezuela is a country of 30 million people. It's 10 times smaller than the US. It doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't spend $780 billion a year on defense. In fact, most of the money that Venezuela does spend goes towards social investment, whether it's healthcare, education, social security, housing, for example. And so this was really the first important sanction, though it's not technically a sanction, and it's a sanction. I say it's a sanction because it was a signal to U.S. corporations and to international corporations that the U.S. government was getting more and more serious in its efforts to overthrow the government of Venezuela, and so that they should start to pull out. And that's exactly what we saw in 2015. Companies started pulling out. They started charging Venezuela more to provide services. And then when Trump comes into office, he takes it a step further. In August 2017, basically issued a sanction against Venezuelan oil, basically an oil embargo, partial. And then in 2019, he through an executive order, he declared, what the Wall Street Journal calls a full economic embargo on Venezuela. These sanctions have had a devastating effect on the people, on the economy. The last estimate I saw was from a UN Special Rapporteur, or former Special Rapporteur, Alfred de Zayas, who said that the sanctions since 2017 had killed 100,000 Venezuelans. And the estimate in terms of the economic losses is $130 billion towards its economy. So, you know, it's a huge amount of pressure. And that's just the economic dimension of this hybrid war. Of course, throughout that, there have been violent coup attempts. You know, the most famous one, of course, is Juan Guaido, in January 2019, when he declared himself president of the country, having the US backing. And really, it was a US idea from all the information we have. Guaido now in Venezuela, he never had any power, and he still doesn't have power, and he's losing more influence by the day. Because in Venezuela right now, there's an ongoing dialogue between the government and the moderate opposition. And we call these people moderate in the sense that they are willing to play politics and go to elections and don't want an invasion or sanctions. But unfortunately, the extreme right wing in Venezuela is fully backed, both financially and logistically and in every way possible, by the US government, and has been for the last 20 years. And so that's a huge source of instability. This extreme right wing has also been responsible for an attempted assassination attempt on President Maduro in August 2018, when they filled a drone, 2 drones full of explosives, and they tried to detonate them over a military parade. Luckily, the drones, you know, were taken down before this could happen. But we've also seen lots of you know, so-called rebellions happen. The last biggest one was on April 30th. But, you know, I should have to say biggest in quotation marks, because on April 30th, 2019, I woke up to news stories of a military rebellion brewing in Venezuela, and it turned out that they had 24 soldiers who took over a highway ramp. So it wasn't particularly threatening, but it's an indication that there are people in Venezuela that are going to do whatever it takes to take power back. And I think what we have in Venezuela is a very deep and kind of nasty at times class war going on. But the Venezuelan people have remained resolute. You know, we have a 3 million person militia and these are people who are willing to risk their lives to stop any sort of coup and invasion.
Thank you. I wanted to say one thing in regard to the sanctions, because especially for our listeners, I mean, sanctions are an act of war. And what they remind me of in a much deeper and much more volatile form is what they do around public schools in the US. They defund public schools to the point where they break them down, and then they claim they're no longer viable, and then they privatize, or they have a charter movement. It's a different kind of analogy, because it's much, much worse what US imperialism has done to countries around the world when they've, you know, basically sanctioned countries to starve people out. And as you put it very, very well, Leo, it's really, really an act of war. I wanted to ask you one last but very important question. And is there anything that you would like to say on how the coronavirus crisis is impacting Venezuela? And also, can you promise to take our message of solidarity back to your comrades and friends and family in Venezuela?
Right. So, to be honest, in February, the coronavirus hadn't really impacted the U.S. as much, but it was impacting other countries overseas. I was personally very, very worried about what was going to happen in Venezuela when the coronavirus appeared. And the first confirmed case happened on March 13th. But, you know, it wasn't quite surprising, but I was very glad to see the immediate steps the government took to halt the spread of the virus. So the day before the first case was confirmed, the government issued a national health emergency. They banned large crowds from gathering, and they canceled all flights into the country from, international flights, basically. Then the next day, the first case was confirmed, and President Maduro, he canceled classes. He required people to wear face masks in public transit and on the border area. He closed bars and theaters and nightclubs, and had restaurants only accept takeout or delivery. So that's day one, right? Some states in this country haven't even taken those steps yet. So that's how serious the government was taking it. By day 4, there was a national quarantine. It's voluntary, but people are being asked to stay at home. And at the last count, I think 95% of the country was following those orders to stay at home. There's also a kind of an innovative tool that the government has used, which is to set up an online portal and to have a health survey on this portal. 20 million people were already registered on this portal because it's a way for people to receive social services. And 17 million people at last count had filled out this survey. So over half the country, Venezuela has 30 million people. So over half the country has filled out a health survey indicating how they feel, whether or not they have coronavirus symptoms related to coronavirus. People who do have symptoms related immediately have doctors visit them in their homes and they're tested. And this is all free of cost, right? And there's also widespread testing of anyone who's come into contact with someone infected with coronavirus. There's testing of anyone who's coming back into Venezuela, because right now there's a disaster in coronavirus throughout the region. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the pictures of Ecuador, but there's,
Yes.
you know, a week ago, there were bodies on the streets of the city of Guayaquil in Ecuador because the health authorities were overwhelmed and people didn't know what to do with their dead family members. So they just put them out on the streets. In Colombia, there's a brewing disaster. I think Colombia has something like 2,000 cases, but there's not widespread testing. So it's more likely much more than that. Venezuela only has 171 cases. That's after almost a month of the coronavirus in the country. So that's kind of an exemplary record so far. And it was done in part, well, not in part, with huge part through help from Cuba and China and Russia and the World Health Organization. Because as we mentioned before, the sanctions had totally devastated Venezuela's economy. And as a result, the health sector has been, you know, hit really hard because there's no money to invest in it.
Right.
There's the sanctions prohibit the importation of certain spare parts that machines need, like say an MRI machine or an X-ray machine, things like that, and even chemicals needed to be used in testing of whether it's coronavirus or any other disease. And so, you know, without this international aid, particularly from China and Cuba, which are, in my opinion, kind of saving the world from this crisis while the US is making it worse, without this aid, Venezuela would be in a terrible position. But right now it's doing incredibly well. I hope it continues. People seem to be, you know, taking this very seriously. And what's really helping is also the economic factor in Venezuela, in the sense that the government didn't just realize the threat to public health from the coronavirus, but the threat to the potential to the economy and specifically the impact on the working class. So if you're staying at home, most people can't work, obviously, right? And so what the government has done is they've suspended rent payments, they've suspended loan payments, they instituted a nationwide firing freeze, both public and private businesses. They're also paying the salaries of workers that work in small and medium businesses, which not only takes care of the workers, but also takes care of these businesses. I mean, we're seeing businesses shut down left and right in DC and Baltimore because of this, and it's only been a month, right? And so the government isn't taking action, whereas in Venezuela it is. So there's kind of a very comprehensive approach to the virus that entails not just public health, but the economy as well. And I think people are, you know, accepting it, and because services have been working very well. Venezuela is leading the region by far in the number of coronavirus tests per million people, per million inhabitants. It's something like 5,000 tests per million people in the country, whereas next door in Colombia, it's 680 tests per million people. So almost 10 times as much testing in Venezuela compared to Colombia, despite the fact that Venezuela is like about half as big as Colombia is. And this to me is really what's keeping the country afloat right now. And it's making it clear who the real enemy is, because even during this coronavirus pandemic, the extreme right wing in Venezuela keeps asking for more sanctions. They keep asking for an invasion, and they're basically working hand in glove. If not, that's probably not the right metaphor, because they're really puppets of the State Department. Mm-hmm. And so the Venezuelan people are realizing this, and you know, there's more and more rejection of Juan Guaido and this right wing element, and more clamor for a negotiated solution to the many crises that Venezuela faces. And yeah, I will happily take the message of solidarity back to Venezuela. And you know, I've been talking a lot to folks in Venezuela, and they're also very worried about what's happening here in the United States, because they see that the Trump administration is making everything worse with coronavirus here at home. And of course, it's not just Trump, it's also authorities at the state and even local level. And that's why we're seeing the coronavirus disproportionately affect Black and brown people. And people in Venezuela are aware of this, and they're also sending their solidarity and support to the people of the United States.
Thank you so much. That was at least a very hopeful message in terms of what is taking place on the ground in Venezuela. It doesn't mean that we can let up our demands to no war against Venezuela or in terms of the sanctions, because it shows you the contrast between the government here and the government in Venezuela. I'd like to say thank you, and we will continue the fight to stop U.S. imperialism and sanctions and build solidarity with the people of Venezuela and around the world. Thank you so much, Leo.
Thank you.